In 1943, American sailors and soldiers entering the harbor at Tulagi, the frontline U.S. Navy base in the South Pacific, passed a billboard telling them to kill Japanese, kill more Japanese. The billboard was signed by Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., their commander. As the war progressed, newspapers quoted Halsey as saying about the Japanese, "We are drowning and burning them all over the Pacific, and it is just as much pleasure to burn them as to drown them." To 21st century ears, Halsey sounds like a racist monster or a sadist. In his own time, however, he was regarded by the public as a war hero, a little outspoken, too crude perhaps, but refreshingly blunt about the true nature of the enemy and the hard job ahead. In the wartime America of the 1940s, Halsey's attitude was unexceptional. Americans routinely referred to the Japanese as Japanese and nips, and often as animals or insects of some kind, most commonly monkeys, baboons, gorillas, dogs, mice, rats, vipers and rattlesnakes, and cockroach. The Japanese were just as bigoted. They depicted Americans and other Westerners as reptiles, worms, insects rendered in cartoons with the faces of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, frogs, octopuses, beached whales and stray dogs. Dehumanizing the enemy to make it easier to kill them is an ancient practice between warring nations, but rarely has it been practiced with more depraved creativity than in the Pacific War. The roots of mutual contempt between Japan and the United States were twisted and deep. The Americans, as historian John Dower has shown, regarded the Japanese as half child, half savage, to be pitied or condescended to, but also to be feared. Before the turn of the 20th century, newspapers and politicians warned of the yellow peril, and when Congress set immigration quotas in the 1920s, Asians were excluded altogether. The Japanese copied the West by modelling their navy on the British Royal Navy, from uniforms to ships, but regarded Westerners as filthy demons who wished to defile the pure Yamamoto race. When the kamikazes flew off on suicide missions against the Americans in the spring of 1945, virgin schoolgirls holding cherry blossoms were mustered to the airfields to wave them goodbye. Some historians see the war between Japan and the United States as a grand tragedy of racial prejudice. It was certainly a cultural misunderstanding on an epic scale. Without suggesting moral equivalence, Japan was the clear aggressor. It is fair to say that both sides blundered into war. Blinded or warped by racial and cultural bias, East and West consistently underestimated or misjudged the other. Before the war, the Americans did not believe the Japanese capable of great military feats, like attacking Pearl Harbor, in part because Japanese were widely regarded in the West as little people, nearsighted, buck-toothed comical figures who made cheap toys and bowed obsequiously. By the same token, the Japanese, whose faith in their own master or divine leading race Shido Minzoku exceeded Adolf Hitler's belief in German superiority, thought that Americans would surrender quickly because they were weak and decadent, a nation of frightened housewives, labor agitators, and greedy plutocrats. When the Americans did not give up but rather kept building more planes and tanks, the Japanese responded with massive suicidal attacks, believing that Americans, selfish and mongrelized, could not stand up to such a show of national unity and self-sacrifice. The Americans eventually decided, as a Fifth Air Force intelligence circular put it in July 1945, that the entire population of Japan is a proper military target. There are no civilians in Japan. The Americans began burning Japanese cities, 66 of them, finally obliterating Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs. The degree to which cultural and racial stereotyping led to fatal misjudgments is remarkable. The Japanese did not think that the Americans had the stamina required for long stretches of submarine duty. So they neglected anti-submarine warfare, with the result that American submarines were able to cut the vital supply lines between Japan and her oil-rich southern colonies. Similarly, the Japanese were lax about changing their communication codes, in part because they thought that the Americans were not smart enough to break them. In the war in the Pacific, misunderstanding and miscalculation reached an apogee, or nadir, in late October 1944, at a naval engagement known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was the biggest naval battle ever fought. The conflict involved more ships, almost 300, more men, nearly 200,000, and covered a larger area, more than 100,000 square miles, roughly the size of the British Isles, than any naval battle in history. The fighting was horrific, dramatic, and courageous, and yet both sides missed their main chance. For Admiral Halsey, the commander of the main American striking force, the battle beckoned as the dream of a lifetime. A brassy, rough-and-ready national hero, dubbed Bull Halsey by the press, he had overcome defeatism early in the war. He believed he was on the verge of the greatest naval victory since Trafalgar, and yet, misjudging the enemy, he fell for a Japanese feint and sailed off in the wrong direction. For the Japanese Navy, the battle offered the opportunity to die gloriously, and possibly to turn around the course of the war. Halsey's mistake opened the way for Admiral Takeo Kurita and the main Japanese battle fleet to descend upon General Douglas MacArthur's landing force invading the Philippines. Up against smaller, weaker ships, destroyers and jeep carriers, the Japanese should have been wolves amongst the sheep. But confused, exhausted and daunted by an unexpected show of American gallantry, Kurita turned his fleet around at the critical moment and jumped home to quiet disgrace. In Japan today, naval scholars still debate Kurita's mysterious retreat. Curiously, in America, the Battle of Leyte Gulf has been largely forgotten. When Americans think of the victorious Good War, they tend to think of D-Day and the liberation of Europe, not the Pacific War. Most people have heard of the Battle of Midway, or seen the image of the Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf blurs together with a dozen other battles fought in jungles or on coral reefs on the other side of civilization. Most Americans do not know when the Battle of Leyte Gulf was fought, where Leyte Gulf is, or even how it's pronounced Leyte. They certainly don't know why the battle mattered. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the battle was a death knell. Never again would the Japanese be able to put to sea to engage the Americans in a fleet action. Without a fleet, the Japanese home islands were cut off, starved, and exposed to American attack. The battle was also, quite possibly, the last big naval battle. Fleets of ships and men have been fighting for thousands of years, but never before or since have they arrayed themselves against each other on such a scale. In the long history of fleet engagements, from Salamis, where the ancient Greeks fought the Persians, through the epic line of battle duels of the 17th century British, French, Dutch and Spanish during the Age of Sail, to the modern clashes of the world wars, the Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as a kind of gory apex. The combatants used every kind of craft, from submarine to kamikaze plane, and employed every type of available weapon, and died every imaginable way, by fire, blast, exposure, drowning and shark attack. At least 13,000 men, along with one of the two greatest battleships ever built, were lost. This is the story of 4 commanders, 2 American, 2 Japanese, whose lives collided in the biggest sea fight of the worst war in modern history. My narrative will follow these men from the breakout of war in December 1941 to the day when they came together in the giant naval engagement in and around the Philippine Islands. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is the climax of this book, although not quite the end of the story for the 3 men who survived it. Cultures clash, nations do battle, but in the end wars are fought and won or lost by the actions of individuals, heroes and cowards, the prudent and wanton, ordinary men reacting, not always predictably, to extraordinary circumstances. The characters of these men often reflect the cultures of their nations. A twisted national culture can corrupt even the purest souls. And yet, individual differences do matter, often critically and sometimes surprisingly. The 4 men in the story that follows had to think, as all warriors do, about their own mortality. Japanese culture, or more precisely the national identity propagandized by the militarists who ran Japan during World War I, venerated death. In American war songs, as historian H.P. Wilmot has noted, Johnny comes marching home again. In Japanese war songs, he marches off to die. But that does not mean that the human beings who fought for Japan were always heedless about wasting lives. Americans, on the other hand, celebrated the individual. The job of an American soldier or sailor, to paraphrase General George S. Patton, was not to die for his country, but to make the enemy die for his. While Japanese commanders extolled spirit, American commanders valued material superiority. But the Americans were no less brave than the Japanese, and at times no less foolhardy. Illness, accident, fate all play a hand in deciding battles and determining the course of history. but the true story of any battle lies in the passage of individual character, a quirky, sometimes fragile and storm-tossed vessel, across the roiled, violent seas of national culture. Our journey begins aboard a ship in a bay on the coast of Japan, 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. On October 9, 1941, the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, some 200 warships, lay anchored in Hiroshima Bay. The early autumn day was clear and bright, the water on the bay was still and peaceful. Shortly after 9 a.m., all the captains of the fleet were summoned to the flagship Nagato. The broad deck of the battleship was cleared of enlisted men. Only officers above the rank of lieutenant commander were allowed to remain. Administrator Matome Ugaki, the chief of staff of the combined fleet, addressed the officers. He was, as usual, unsmiling and severe. "It may be that this is the last meeting of all the combined fleet officers," he began. His booming voice uncharacteristically faltered. "We may not be able to see each other in this fashion." One of the destroyer captains, Commander Tamechi Hara, was taken aback by the slight crack in Ugaki's stern facade. War against the West was coming, and Hara and the rest of the officers knew it. Most of them were not privy to the plan to strike the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, but it was clear that their relentless training would soon become actual combat. The Japanese trained day and night in all weather. The Japanese Naval Week, the men lamely joked, was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday. Because they would be outnumbered and outgunned by the Americans, the Japanese High Command had decreed their forces would rely on seishin, spirit. The Japanese Empire was reaching far beyond its home islands. Imperial forces had struck north, absorbing Korea and Manchuria, west into China, and south, annexing Southeast Asia as far as the Malay Peninsula. Now, in addition to attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan planned to conquer the British colony of Singapore and all of Dutch-controlled Indonesia with its vital resources, especially oil, and to build an outer defense of fortified islands through the Pacific. Commander Hara had his doubts that seishin would be enough to defeat the American, British, and Dutch navies, and he went to see Ugaki in his cabin aboard the Nagato the next morning. Stone-faced as usual, Ugaki listened to Hara's reservations. The destroyer captain asked, "Couldn't the Japanese avoid total war? Maybe strike south and take oil-rich Indonesia, but skirt the Philippines and avoid confrontation with the United States?" "Too late," said Ugaki. Diplomacy was running out. Japan did not seek war with the United States, but it had no choice. America's refusal to sell the Japanese oil and steel was slowly choking the empire. Japan had to strike swiftly or die. Hara listened, groaning inwardly, he later recalled, because he realized that further discussion was useless. For all his pride, Ugaki was uneasy. A week after he deflected Captain Hara's questions, Ugaki sat down in his cabin aboard the Nagato and began writing a diary. He entitled it Isoroku, the seaweed of war, or, as he also called it, the wastebasket of war. The title was curiously self-effacing. Ugaki was seen as a proud, even arrogant man. He was, in a culture that revered the military, a kind of war god. Naval officers had an elevated social status in pre-war Japan. Etajima, the Naval Academy, turned away 30 applicants for everyone it accepted. Its graduates were regarded as more gentlemanly, less crudely brutal than army officers, though brutality was a relative term. Japan was an island nation, isolated from the world for much of its history, until suddenly, in the 20th century, it became hungrily expansionist. The navy was the empire's sword and shield. Naval officers were modern samurai, the ancient warriors who could, with impunity, cut down disobedient commoners in the road. If an enlisted man failed to salute an officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the officer was required to strike the man 5 times with his fist. Ugaki sometimes did not bother to return salutes from the lower ranks. Like a character in a kabuki play, he revealed little, maintaining a kind of ritualized sternness and impassivity. His sailors called him the Golden Mask, after a mysterious superhero in a popular comic book of the day. He was distant and aloof and seemed coldly confident, but he was deeply ambivalent about the coming war against the United States. Japan was already stuck in a bloody, undeclared war with China, a 4-year quagmire that the Japanese preferred to call the China Incident. Ugaki had been all for the aggression into China in the beginning, But now, writing in his diary, he recorded his regret and guilt with the precise and elegant brushwork of an educated man writing in ancient Japanese. Did the persons responsible for starting the incident ever dream, or realize that it would develop into the present state? We can't be proud of human wisdom. Ugaki was feeling ashamed of his own part in the run-up to a much larger war. In the senior councils of the combined fleet, and twice in private audiences with the Emperor, he made the case for annexing Southeast Asia for its natural resources. He had gone along with Japan's formal alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, although against his better judgment. He had raised his glass at a ceremony to mark the signing of the Axis Pact, wondering, he recorded in his diary, whether this will turn out to be a victory cup or a bitter dose for the future empire. He reflected, uncomfortably, that he had been one of those crying, "Wolf, wolf," for several years in order to maintain and heighten the morale of the country. But now, he regretted, big wolves are lurking around us. The coming war against America and its Western allies, he wrote, will be the greatest on record. Ugaki's ambivalence, well hidden beneath a mask of command to all but a few probing or perceptive souls like Captain Hara, was not unusual among senior Japanese naval officers on the eve of the war that would ruin Japan. A significant minority, including Ugaki's boss, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, held serious reservations about the coming conflict. They understood that Japan lacked the resources to defeat America, but LK Ugaki, they raised their cups to victory and tried to ignore the bitter taste. Ugaki, like many well-educated, sensitive Japanese men of his time, and all the times that came before, was accustomed to ambivalence. Americans needed certainty and tended to view the world in simplistic terms. But Ugaki was used to living with contradiction. It gave depth to a man. Ugaki was deeply read in Buddhist philosophy. He did not smile, but he felt powerfully. Seeking to appreciate the essence of the moment, he wrote small poems in his diary. As a seaman, he began every diary entry with the weather, but then often reflected on nature's beauty, recalling how the moon hung on the edge of the mountain or pining over the last fall of cherry blossoms in the spring. Ugaki was caught in a web of obligations, sometimes conflicting, to his emperor, to his navy, to his family, to himself. Some of Ugaki's countrymen were paralyzed by a sense of duty that could not possibly be fulfilled. The Japanese word for thank you, arigato, can also be translated, "You have placed me under a heavy obligation." Ugaki accepted his obligations as the natural order of things. It did not bother him that conflict led to tragedy, to double or even multiple suicides. As a schoolboy, Ugaki, like all Japanese schoolboys, had taken to heart the tale of the 47 Ronin, the true story of ancient samurai who killed themselves after committing murder to avenge their lord's honor. Many, if not most, of the great Japanese stories ended tragically. Ugaki, like most Japanese, enjoyed the drama and accepted the outcome as just or, in any case, inevitable. Raised modestly in a small village by a family with samurai ancestors, Ugaki lived in a world balanced, often incongruously and a bit precariously, between old and new, caste and west. His house in Tokyo was traditionally Japanese, with rice paper screens and sleeping mats, but like most Japanese homes, it had a western room, with heavy furniture and tasseled lamps. Aboard the Nagato, lunch was western and grand, from soup to dessert, eaten off silver and china and ending with finger bowls. Supper was eastern and spare, sliced raw fish and boiled egg custard, consumed with chopsticks. Japan had travelled from feudalism to modernity in less than a century. The Navy's new fighter plane, the Zero, was a marvel of aeronautical engineering, but the planes were delivered from the factory in ox carts. The plane's name came from the 00 marked on its fuselage for the 2600th anniversary of Jimmu, the birth of the first emperor god of Japan. Like all Japanese, Ugaki believed the saying, more or less true, that for 2,600 years our empire has never known defeat. The Zero, faster and more maneuverable than Western fighter planes, would show the Americans how far Japan had come. Only over time would the Zero reveal its Achilles heel. Unlike the American planes, the unarmored Zero did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. They tended to burn or explode when hit by even a single, caliber round. The Japanese did not worry as much as Westerners about pilot safety, nor did they train enough pilots or build enough planes. Ugaki was not unusual in concealing his feelings. Japanese can be very expressive when they speak, gesturing and exclaiming with loud sighs, but their eyes reveal little to Westerners. Administrator Shigeyoshi Inoue, the revered chief of the Naval Bureau, was a warm-hearted, intelligent man, but he was also expressionless. Others adopted an expression of unwavering ferocity. Administrator Jisaburo Ozawa, Japan's best fleet commander, was called Onigawara, after a kind of stylized roof tile imprinted with the face of a devil to ward off evil spirits. The formal portraits of all Japanese admirals of the time are striking in their severity. Impassivity, silent authority, these were qualities to be admired and emulated. When the emperor appeared for the passing-out ceremony of young midshipmen at Etajima, he never spoke a word. The ceremony was conducted in complete silence. As an admiral permitted a rare audience at the imperial palace, Ugaki had bowed before the small, grave figure of Emperor Hirohito, whose expression was fixed, almost blank. The emperor was revered and worshipped as a true god. High school principals, who failed to rescue the emperor's portrait when their wooden schoolhouses caught fire, were so stricken with shame that they had been known to commit suicide. The last and most important duty of the captain aboard a sinking ship was to make sure the emperor's portrait had been taken from his cabin and safely bundled into a lifeboat. Then the captain would be free to go down with his ship. In war councils attended by Ugaki, the emperor seemed optimistic, insisting that his troops could succeed if only they would try harder. On the other hand, the emperor would privately predict disaster. Word of imperial pessimism would seep back to Navy headquarters from court gossip. It was one more contradiction, another of life's mysteries that Ugaki had to live with. His was not to question, but to recall the words of the Navy's anthem, faithfully memorized in Etajima days. Across the sea, corpses in the water. Across the mountain, corpses in the field. I shall die only for the emperor. I shall never look back. Writing in one of his first diary entries on October 18, 1941, Ugaki turned his thoughts to the extraordinary grand festival of Yasukuni Shrine, where the souls of some 15,000 fallen Japanese soldiers and sailors, killed in the China incident, were being enshrined that day. Ugaki, like all military men, had worshipped at Yasukuni many times. The Shrine of the Righteous Souls was an inescapable presence in Tokyo. On the radio, over and over, blared the song, "You and I are cherry blossoms, having bloomed, we're resolved to die. But we'll meet again at Yasukuni, blooming on the same treetop Ugaki had walked beneath the cherry blossoms in spring, past the old ladies selling 1,000 stitches stomach wrappers, good luck charms to stop bullets, to the top of Kudan Hill, the highest point in Tokyo. He had passed beneath the great torii, sacred gateways, and washed his hands, then washed out his mouth, before passing under the 16-petal gold chrysanthemum, the symbol of the emperor, into the simple wooden shrine. He had bowed low to the spirits of the fallen warriors, who never really die but go to Yasukuni, to rest, to be reborn, and to one day fight again. Purified, Ugaki had walked past the triumphal column bearing the statue of Masujiro Omura, the Vice Minister of War in the Meiji Restoration and great modernizer of the Japanese military. Omura had designed Japan's first Western-style warship and had often worn Western clothes. But on his European-style pedestal high above Yasukuni, Omura is garbed in a samurai's robe and carries the samurai long sword for battle and short sword for committing seppuku, suicide, better known to Westerners as harakiri, belly-cutting. Visitors did not remark, at least not in public, on the irony that he had been murdered by samurai swordsmen rebelling against modernity. In his diary, Ugaki mused that if he could be so honored, if his soul would one day rest at Yasukuni, then he would be content. Ugaki was a deeply religious man. He read ancient Buddhist texts and, like most Japanese, at the same time worshipped Shinto, the nationalistic religion whose true god was the state. Passengers on streetcars were required to stand and bow reverently when passing the imperial palace. He knew from the ancients to accept suffering and impermanence, to laugh at privation. A hungry samurai, it was said, used a toothpick to pick his teeth after not eating. As an admiral, former battleship commander, former operations chief of the Naval Bureau, now chief of staff to the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Ugaki was exalted by the growing militarism of Japan. While subject to the emperor, the military had been elevated above all other branches of government by a flaw in the Meiji constitution, which gave veto power over the formation of a cabinet to the uniformed services. He had embodied the subtle distortions of the samurai code, Bushido, manipulated by the military government to make dying for one's country the glory and duty of all. He was, like the lowliest Japanese soldier, both honored and trapped. By military regulation, no Japanese soldiers or sailors were to be taken prisoner. They were to die first, killing themselves if necessary. Ugaki's model, the ideal for all military men, was General Marisuke Nogi, the chief military advisor to the Emperor Meiji. After sending 58,000 men human bullets, including his two sons, to their deaths in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, he had asked the emperor's permission to take his own life. Meiji had asked Nogi to hold off until he, Meiji, passed away. On the day of the emperor's funeral in 1912, Nogi, dressed in white, helped his wife die by plunging a dagger into her neck. Then he disemboweled himself with a short samurai sword. Hearing the news, his pupil, the young Prince Hirohito, who had addressed Nogi as schoolmaster, had wept, stunned into speechlessness. Hirohito was 12 years old, too young to see the perverse effect of Nogi's twisted morality on his nation, but many years later he told an American reporter that Nogi's influence on him had been lasting and profound. At the time there had been some grumbling in the newspapers. Hadn't Junshi, following one's lord to his death, been outlawed in 1663 as antiquated and barbaric? But the complaints died away, buried by enthusiasm for the new Bushido. Sake, a rice wine with a high alcohol content, provided the only relief from this stern code. Drinking sake in large quantities was an acceptable release for Japanese naval officers. On joint manoeuvres during the First World War, British naval officers, no slouches at imbibing spirits, were amazed by the quantities of sake consumed by their Japanese counterparts. The Japanese, as a people, were extraordinarily forgiving of drunks. Sake parties quietly ignored society's strict rules. At sake parties in Tokyo, men sat in one another's laps and sometimes wept. Ugaki was known to stay out all night drinking with fellow officers. It was the only time he dropped his mask. No one seemed to mind or even notice, except, that is, for Ugaki's boss. Admiral Yamamoto thought that Ugaki was a drunk and, at first, barely spoke to his chief of staff. Ugaki hardly mentioned his commander-in-chief in the early days of his diary, but not because he felt confident about their relationship. Rather, in the Japanese custom, he was avoiding any criticism of his superior. In his diary entry for Monday, October 20th, Ugaki noted, "The commander-in-chief bantered at me. 'You got up this morning at the time you went to bed last night, eh?' Admiral Yamamoto may have been bantering, but with an edge. As Ugaki was uncomfortably aware, Yamamoto was not fond of his number two. Isoroku Yamamoto was the most intelligent, most able officer in the Japanese Navy, and it was America's misfortune, though ultimately Japan's, that he was able to disturb the conventional thinking of his fellow officers and forge the Imperial Japanese Navy into a formidable and daring striking force. Japan's warrior culture produced some great warriors, and Yamamoto was the most gifted of the age of Showa, the reign of Hirohito. He was by no means a prig. Though he did not drink, he loved to gamble. Poker, mahjong, billiards, roulette he joked about retiring to Monte Carlo. He engaged avidly in what Japanese officers called S for sex play. While Ugaki and his cronies had been downing sake, Yamamoto had slipped off to visit his geisha. His nickname among the geisha girls was 80 sen, because it cost 100 sen to get a manicure from a geisha girl, and Yamamoto was missing 2 of his 10 fingers. Yamamoto's middle and index fingers had been blown off by an exploding gun at the Battle of Chima in 1905, when Yamamoto was a cadet serving on a battleship. He had played a small but sufficiently bloody role in Japan's most glorious of all victories, the smashing defeat of a Russian fleet that announced Japan's arrival as a 20th century great power. At 5'3", slightly stooped and with almost feminine features, Yamamoto did not look like much of a warrior. But he was a well-known daredevil, who as a young officer had performed handstands on the rails of ships. At 57, 8 years older than Ugaki, Yamamoto was the Navy's brightest star, outspoken, imaginative, and commanding. Yamamoto's differences with Ugaki were not really over dissipation, which each enjoyed in his own way. The two men were opposites in more fundamental ways. Yamamoto was a creature of the future. He looked forward to an age of modern warfare and recoiled at its implications for his homeland. Ugaki looked to the past with a fatalistic reverence and not only accepted but longed for his own glorious demise. Ugaki had not been Yamamoto's choice as Chief of Staff. Ugaki had been imposed on him by the senior admirals of the General Staff, who, in Yamamoto's caustic reckoning, rated seniority and cronyism over skill. Yamamoto would later come to see Ugaki's more philosophical side, and Ugaki would come to recognize the martial realism of his commander-in-chief. But when Ugaki first took over as Yamamoto's Chief of Staff in August of 1941, the two men were badly matched. They did not understand each other. To Yamamoto, Ugaki was one of those martinets who had spent too much time in Germany. Ugaki had studied in Berlin in the early 1930s, and like many of his compatriots, he had been impressed by the totalitarian perfection of National Socialism, which, to men like Ugaki, seemed almost Confucian in its emphasis on obedience and loyalty. Ugaki admired German technology. At the same time, he felt a kinship with officers schooled with Prussian discipline and nationalistic fervour. Yamamoto had no use for Hitler and had strongly opposed an alliance with Germany. He did not respect goose-stepping Prussians. His military ideal came from Great Britain. British naval officers, Yamamoto believed, were cosmopolitan and nimble, able to think on their feet. The Japanese Naval Academy, Etajima, had been founded by the imitative Japanese on the British model, patterned after the Royal Navy's training academy at Dartmouth. The red bricks to build Etajima's elegant Georgian-style main building had been imported, each brick carefully wrapped from England. A lock of Admiral Lord Nelson's hair was kept at Etajima as a sacred relic. But more recently, Yamamoto feared, the British influence was wearing off. Etajima men were becoming automatons, their originality and initiative beaten out of them by the grueling regimen. The Etajima grads with the highest class rank, who were usually the most rigid and smug and inflexible, were given shore billets at headquarters and rose the fastest through the ranks. Yamamoto counted his chief of staff among these dogmatic paper pushers. Unlike Ugaki, who loathed arrogant America, Yamamoto was an admirer, or at least a respecter, of Americans. As a young officer, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard, and he had seen firsthand the automobile assembly lines in Detroit. He understood that Japan could never begin to match America, which every year produced 12 times as much steel as Japan in an all-out arms race. Yamamoto had been frustrated by the naval officers who, like Ugaki, wanted to abandon naval disarmament treaties signed in the 1920s and try to outdo the Americans in a race to build the greatest fleet of Leviathans. Yamamoto had long worried that Japan's ambitions would eventually provoke a confrontation with the United States. Japan's cities were giant fire traps, made of paper and wood, Yamamoto warned. What if the Americans bombed them? Yamamoto subscribed to Life magazine and left copies of the American Picture magazine about the wardroom for officers to see. One of those articles wrote glowingly of the new Anglo-American invention radar. It's not clear that Yamamoto's subordinates paid much attention. They had faith in the superior eyesight of the Japanese race. The Japanese see better in the dark, the Japanese believed. So they trained extra hard for night battle. At least there were a few Navy men who saw the recklessness of war with America, Yamamoto consoled himself. The army was hopeless. Far less cosmopolitan than the Navy, the army generals were so in love with spirit over modernization that they were said to oppose the paving of roads because it would damage the horses' hooves. As Vice Minister of the Navy, Yamamoto had been blunt about the craze for a new order, a blend of Bushido and Asian imperialism that would dominate the East, and inevitably provoke war with the West. At a meeting of vice ministers in 1939, Yamamoto had demanded, "They talk of a new order, but what the hell do they mean by it?" Yamamoto's bluntness was refreshing, especially in a society in which people made an art form of not saying what they really thought. He had a loyal following among some of the wiser heads in the Navy. But the young hotheads in the army, and not a few rabid junior officers in the Navy, wanted to kill him. Assassination was becoming a tool of governance in Japan in the 1930s. Incredibly, Yamamoto, the Navy's vice minister and the most respected naval figure since Admiral Heihachiro Togo, the hero of the Battle of Tsushima, had been made commander-in-chief of the combined fleet for his own safety. His friends and supporters needed to get him out of Tokyo. Officers were joking, better not get in the same car as the vice minister, and a sinister order called the League for Carrying Out the Holy War had demanded his resignation. In Hirohito's reign, the age of Showa, junior army and navy officers sometimes seemed to have more real power than the emperor. Denounced by the militarists as a spy, Yamamoto was compelled to accept police protection. Before he left for the fleet, machine guns were set up around the Navy Ministry. It was a strange, paranoid time in Japan. The country was gripped with spy fever. In June 1941, a National Anti-Espionage Week was declared. A leading newspaper editorialized that Westerners living in Japan should be prohibited from owning carrier pigeons. In Tokyo, the Interior Ministry's Special Hire Police, also known as the Thought Police, patrolled for orthodoxy. Western ballroom dancing and golf were banned. Baseball was not, though umpires were forbidden from using the English word strike. The government routinely lied about the stalemated war in China. Schoolchildren were taught to chant, "Brave Japanese, cowardly Chinks, brave Japanese, cowardly Chinks." Newspapers duly reported that Japanese officers were having contests to determine who could lop off the most heads of Chinese prisoners. Ultranationalists demanded a holy war. Japan would liberate Asia and the Pacific archipelagos from their white Western oppressors, though in the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, some Asians were more equal than others. The burden was to be divided according to racial and national ability. Japan, political leadership and heavy industry; China, light industry and manual labor; Korea, rice; Manchuria, animal husbandry. According to the Shinto faith, as shrilly propagandized in the early 1940s, Japanese were superior to all races. Soft and decadent, Americans were no match. A bestseller, Why Fear the United States, concluded, "If at the outset Japan just seized Guam and the Philippines, we can fight with our bare fists if necessary." Yamamoto knew this was poppycock. He had been stationed in America in 1927 when Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic. That was the real America, Yamamoto believed, scientific and adventurous. He repeatedly warned that a war against America would be suicidal. On September 29, 1941, only 10 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, he wrote the Chief of the Naval General Staff that it was obvious that a war with the United States would be protracted, that the United States would never stop fighting, that ultimately we would not be able to escape defeat, and that as a result of this war, people of this nation will be reduced to absolute poverty. And yet Yamamoto, like a true Japanese, was duty-bound, and, in his way, almost as fatalistic as Ugaki. "I find my position extremely odd, obliged to make up my mind and pursue unswervingly a course that is precisely the opposite of my own personal views," he wrote a friend on October 11th. Perhaps this, too, is the will of heaven. If war was inevitable, he would fight it the best way he knew how. At Etajima, he had practiced kendo, a martial art that seeks to knock out the enemy in a single blow. Yamamoto proposed to try to do the same to the Americans. Since his days as a naval attaché in Washington in the mid-1920s, he had been fascinated with the ideas of General Billy Mitchell, who had insisted that the best way to sink ships was not with guns, but by bombing them with planes. As a rising commander in the combined fleet and as Navy Vice Minister, Yamamoto had insisted that Japan build aircraft carriers, not battleships. Now, as Commander-in-Chief, his plan was to try to sink the American Pacific Fleet at its forward base in Hawaii with a surprise air raid, a bomb and torpedo attack against U.S. battleships and aircraft carriers at anchor in Pearl Harbor. It was to be a daring, brilliant, dramatic stroke, though Yamamoto was not confident that the blow would knock out America for good. "My plan is one conceived in desperation," he wrote another friend that October of 1941. Ugaki had played little role in the planning for Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had essentially cut out his chief of staff, preferring to rely on a senior staff officer, Captain Kameto Kuroshima. A brilliant eccentric with a morbid turn of mind, Kuroshima was known for shutting himself in his cabin, closing the dead lights on his porthole, stripping naked, and smoking continuously while burning incense as he worked around the clock. Ugaki was left to handle other more routine fleet matters. Ugaki was not a freethinker like Yamamoto. He was orthodox. He was a battleship man. He had been trained all his career to believe that victory would finally be achieved in a long-range gun duel fought primarily by battleships. Ugaki's faith was perfectly normal for a naval officer in the early 1940s. The Japanese Navy, like most of the world's great navies, was almost cult-like in its devotion to a one-time shootout between giant battleships, or, as the British called them, dreadnoughts. Ugaki had briefly commanded a battleship, the Hyuga, and he had his eye on another greater behemoth, the largest, most powerful battleship ever built. From the bridge of Yamamoto's flagship, the 38,500-ton Nagato, Ugaki had been watching the new super battleship Yamato, 73,000 tons, painted silver grey, with a giant gold imperial chrysanthemum adorning her bow, crashing through the waves at almost 30 knots. Magnificent indeed, Ugaki crowed in his diary on October 20th. The Yamato was hippie, belted with thick steel but sleek, her smokestack raked and her superstructure towering like a modern skyscraper. Yamato's 9 18-inch guns could lob shells weighing 3,200 pounds apiece. The Nagato's standard 16-inch gun shell weighed 2,200 pounds. A single one of the Yamato's gun turrets, weighing almost 3,000 tons, was heavier than the largest American destroyer. Ugaki did not know these precise dimensions. The Yamato was a secret weapon, first planned in 1934, when international naval treaties restricted the size of Japan's warships. During her construction, she had been shielded by a rope screen so large that local fishermen had complained of a hemp shortage. Foreigners aboard trains passing the shipyard were ordered to lower their blinds until the train had passed. The Yamato's vastness was designed with the Americans in mind. To match her, the Americans would have to build battleships that were too wide to fit through the Panama Canal. The name Yamato had been carefully chosen to inspire national piety. Yamato was the cradle of Japanese civilization. A sister ship, launched shortly after the Yamato, was named the Musashi, after the ancient plane upon which Tokyo had been built. When Japanese schoolchildren sang their traditional song, "We're Children of the Sea," they now added a verse, "Let's go, aboard the battleship, we'll defend the nation of the sea." The Japanese were hardly alone in battleship worship. In 1901, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany had described the modern battleship as a consummate expression of human purpose and national character. The Kaiser, like the heads of state of all the great powers, had been reading the works of a retired American admiral named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who in 1889 wrote a book titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660–1783. The late 19th century preached a doctrine known as navalism, roughly that the key to national greatness was to control the sea with large battle fleets. The British, who had ruled the seas for a century, celebrated Mahan, as did Teddy Roosevelt when he sent America's Great White Fleet around the world in 1907. Mahan's greatest believers were the Japanese. More of Mahan's books were translated into Japanese than any other language. On the eve of World War I, the Germans had given a name to the fight-to-the-death fleet battle at sea, Der Tag, the day. The Japanese called it Kantai Kessen, decisive battle. All great powers war-gamed for the final, all-out, ship-to-ship fleet engagement. The Americans called their plan, to send a fleet halfway around the world to defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy, War Plan Orange. The Japanese hoped they would come ahead, into an ambush. Under the Japanese war plan Yogeki Sakusen, cruisers and submarines would whittle down the advancing American fleet with torpedo attacks, then battleships would crush it in a final gun duel. The key to victory in this last naval Armageddon would be to simply outrange the Americans. The 18-inch guns of the Yamato and the Musashi could stand off and destroy the American ships, whose mere 16-inch guns could not shoot as far. There was a historical flaw in the decisive battle doctrine, generally overlooked by its devotees. For much of naval history, massive fleet actions had been indecisive. Wind and weather and that bane of admirals, poor communications, disrupted the elaborate manoeuvring of warships, or commanders broke off and sailed away to spare their fleets from annihilation. Mahan had been deeply influenced by Admiral Lord Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 over the French and Spanish fleets, which allowed Britannia to rule the waves in fact as well as song for the rest of the 19th century. Mahan's theories had been seemingly vindicated by the smashing victory of the Japanese over the Russians at Tsushima in 1905 and the American destruction of the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines and Santiago, Cuba, in 1898. But the one great sea battle of World War I between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea off of Jutland was a stalemate. Thousands of sailors were killed in ship-to-ship bombardments, but because of missed signals, luck and blunder, the Germans, seemingly trapped, were allowed to slip away. Jutland's muddled outcome in June 1916 did not stop the navies of all great powers from continuing to plan for decisive battle in the next Great War, but it made more creative commanders wonder if the standard battleship duel could really turn the fate of nations in a day. Over time, partly under the influence of Admiral Yamamoto, Ugaki would come to doubt the wisdom of a decisive battle strategy, especially as the day approached when he would actually fight in one. But in 1941, he was still a creature of conventional wisdom, a product of General Staff thinking. He was susceptible to the parochialism described by British historian B. H. Liddell Hart, who wrote after the war, "A battleship had long been to an admiral what a cathedral is to a bishop." Admiral Yamamoto was free of such cant. He had opposed building the Yamato and the Musashi. In modern warfare, Yamamoto warned, a battleship would be about as useful as a samurai sword. He rejected arguments that torpedoes and bombs would bounce off the Yamato's thick armor plate. "There is no such thing as an unsinkable ship," he argued. "The fiercest serpent may be overcome by a swarm of ants. Carrier-based airplanes, he foresaw, would be the deadly swarm." The old guard in the Imperial Japanese Navy demurred. One former commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Zengo Yoshida, refused to fly in an airplane, but Yamamoto surrounded himself with brilliant young officers like the intense Captain Kuroshima and Sea Dr. Minoru Genda Madman Genda, a true genius who understood air power and wryly joked, "The great follies of the world were the Great Wall of China, the pyramids, and the battleship Yamato." Not always patiently, they pointed out the simple fact that the airplane had greater range than any gun on any battleship. Yamamoto finally persuaded the reluctant admirals on the Navy General Staff to go along with a carrier-based attack on Pearl Harbor by calling their bluff. Yamamoto did not yet trust Ugaki enough to go to Tokyo to argue his case. He sent Captain Kuroshima to warn the General Staff that unless they approved the Pearl Harbor plan, Yamamoto would resign. Ready to plunge south to invade Indonesia, unsure how to stop the American fleet from attacking its exposed flank, the old admirals finally went along with Yamamoto and his young Turks. Yamamoto was summoned to be given his orders, instructed to arrive at the Navy Ministry in Tokyo on November 3rd quietly, discreetly, evading others' notice. Ugaki was left minding routine business aboard the Nagato. He was nursing an aching tooth and brooding. He went fishing in the sunshine, which seemed to cheer him up. It was the birthday of the Emperor Meiji, and all the ships in the fleet were dressed with flags. Ugaki recorded in his diary, "The autumn sky was serenely high and my reflections deep. Oh, this sacred age of Showa! When I reflect upon the great achievements of past heroes and the sacred virtue of the Emperor with his great and glorious works, they inspire me with fresh courage." He expressed his exultation with a short poem that is chilling in its sentiment and brevity. "You die, you all die for the sake of the land. L too will die." Ugaki terribly missed his wife Tomoko, who had died the year before. A photo, taken in 1936, shows Tomoko looking young, slender, and ethereal. A son, Hiromitsu, who would later become a naval doctor, stands in a cadet's uniform, round-faced and bookish. As Yamamoto planned for the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ugaki decided to pay a rare visit to his extended family, various cousins and in-laws living with his son at his house in Tokyo. "All my family were surprised at my unexpected appearance," Ugaki wrote in his diary on November 6th. They all complained of the shortage of food and the scarcity of necessities. Squeezed by the American embargo, no rubber, scrap iron, steel, aluminum, magnesium, copper, brass, zinc, nickel, tin, lead, airplane parts, or oil. Japan was looking threadbare and pinched on the eve of war. Fishermen had gone back to oars and sails and could no longer venture into deeper water. The fish markets now offered mussels and crabs, not tuna. But, Ugaki continued, I didn't notice that anyone had lost weight. He allowed that after the death of my Tomoko, they have been experiencing considerable hardships, but briskly concluded they are getting along and they will have to keep on somehow. Ugaki returned to duty aboard the Nagato, where his thoughts were preoccupied with the coming attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of November 19th, he was thrilled by the sight of a queer-shaped submarine with no mark or number heading south. His eye was drawn to the tiny midget submarine cradled on the deck of the larger sub, which proved to be the I-22 flagship of the IJN's 1st Submarine Division. After a final sake party at the base at Kure, the submarines were headed down the inland sea, then to the east toward Hawaii. As Ugaki was well aware, they were on what was likely to be a suicide mission. On the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack, called X-Day, 5 midget subs were to slip down the narrow, shallow channel into the harbor and torpedo-anchored warships. At first, Admiral Yamamoto had rejected the attack proposal, arguing that the midget subs' 2-man crews would never get out alive. The cruising range of the little subs was increased from 5 to 16 hours, giving the subs at least a slight chance to get in, attack, and then escape to sea to find their mother ships. Grudgingly, Yamamoto assented to adding the midget subs to the attack force. Ugaki was not worried about whether the subs could return. In his diary, he wrote of seeing the young lieutenants who would pilot the subs, standing on deck, smiling. They expect never to return alive, Ugaki wrote approvingly. It is certain that Ugaki recalled from his school days an episode that had been seared in his consciousness. In April 1910, when Ugaki was a student at Etajima, a Japanese submarine No. 6 had sunk in the mud of Hiroshima Bay, just a few miles from where Ugaki was studying. Without an escape hatch, the crew of 14 was doomed, but they kept at their duties until the end when the sub was raised the next day. Their bodies were found still sitting at their battle stations. The commander of the ship, Lieutenant Tsutomu Sakuma, wrote a letter as he slowly asphyxiated. I am sorry that my carelessness sank the Emperor's submarine and killed the Emperor's sailors, the letter began. We are willing to die for our country, but I regret one point, that our deaths might discourage the people of this nation. My sincere hope, gentlemen, is that the accident will give you material to study diligently the problems of submarine design and construction. 12:30, very hard to breathe, gasping. The letter was enshrined at the Naval Academy, where it is today. Lieutenant Sakuma was worshipped as a military martyr, along with Takeo Hirose, an officer who died in action while leading 77 volunteers, chosen from 2,000, on a suicidal mission during the Russo-Japanese War. These models of self-sacrifice, both Etajima men, had a profound effect on young Ugaki. Along with the other cadets of Etajima, Ugaki had marched at the funeral of Sakuma and the rest of Vosix's crew in the spring of 1910, as the cherry blossoms fell. Ugaki had been shaped, or perhaps warped, by his years at Etajima. It was, and still is, a beautiful, sacred place, set on a bay, behind a mountain, on an island in the inland sea. Etajima men were instructed in table manners, introductions, and the making of toasts and speeches by teachers imported from Britain. They were told that an officer in the Imperial Navy must always travel first class and never be seen carrying packages. On the other hand, they were brutalized. Captain Hara, the destroyer commander who had confronted Ugaki after he emotionally addressed the fleet officers on October 9th, was a few years behind Ugaki at Etajima. He recalled being greeted by a senior cadet who punched him in the face a dozen times for failing to properly salute. Every Sunday, the freshmen lined up in the college yard and stood at attention in the broiling sun for 4 or 5 hours, while the upperclassmen beat them. After a few months of such treatment, the newcomers became sheep-like in their obedience, wrote Hara in a memoir. Ugaki, like all freshmen, memorized the imperial rescript for soldiers and sailors, promulgated in 1882. Rule number 1. The soldiers and sailors should consider loyalty their essential duty. He sang the Academy song, "Our hearts throb more and more with the hot blood of the sons of the sacred land. We shall never stop sacrificing ourselves." He was instructed in the meaning of valor, epitomized in the word gyokusai, which literally means broken gem, from the proverb, "It is better to be a gem that is smashed to atoms than a tile that is whole." And yet, as X-Day approached, he tossed and turned. The China War, though it has been a sacred enterprise, had caused Japan great losses over 4 years, and the war Japan aimed to start now would be bigger by far, Ugaki admitted in his diary. "War is a serious affair of state," he mused on November 23rd. On the other hand, he wondered, when would there ever be a better chance to smite the enemy, to push him down? He tried to be Zen-like. "Whatever is to be, will be," he wrote. "We have to let the situation run its course. That's the way of the world, and I must live resignedly in the world without any peevishness. Let me give up such trivial thoughts and go to bed." Cut out of the operational planning for X-Day, Ugaki had been given more ceremonial duties, like composing the Commander-in-Chief's message to the Pearl Harbor attack fleet. This was a grave obligation to Ugaki, and he turned to history. He borrowed from Lord Nelson at Trafalgar, England, "Expects every man to do his duty," and Admiral Togo at Tsushima. "The fate of our empire depends upon this fight. Every man is expected to act with his utmost efforts." Ugaki wrote, "The fate of the empire depends upon this war. Let every man do his duty, exerting his utmost effort." Ugaki showed this draft to Captain Yasugi Watanabe, who was known as staff officer for chess, since his chief duty seemed to be playing shogi Japanese chess with the Commander-in-Chief Yamamoto, usually beat Watanabe. But on at least one occasion he had bet and lost his entire uniform. Watanabe asked Ugaki to change a couple of words, which he said were too archaic. Ugaki went back to work, polishing the draft until it read, "The fate of our empire depends on this expedition. Each of you will do his duty, wearing yourselves to the bone." Ugaki's effort, as it appears in English translation, seems clunky and contrived, not up to his private poetry, but he was typically trying to merge East and West, honour his ancestors, and please his commander-in-chief. At any rate, he was pleased with himself. "How this message will impress all the ranks and ratings on their ships already deployed on the Pacific," he crowed in his diary on Sunday, December 7th. Ugaki would be safely aboard the combined fleet's flagship in a Japanese harbour several thousand miles away from the battle. Still, he had already slipped a bit of hair and nail parings into a closed envelope for his son as a warrior's final memento, to be opened upon his death. Ugaki's sleeping quarters were next to Admiral Yamamoto's in a suite of rooms toward the stern of the Nagato. This flag country included a large and formal conference room where the Emperor's portrait was kept, and where Yamamoto and his staff dined to the accompaniment of the flagship's 40-piece band, lined up outside on deck at lunch. At 3 on the morning of December 8th, December 7th in Hawaii, Ugaki awoke, anxious to hear the news. "I was having a smoke when Air Staff Officer Commander Akira Sasaki hurried into my room and reported, at 3:19 Wireless 2 is being sent repeatedly. 2 is the first syllable of Totsugeki, charge." Admiral Yamamoto was in the conference room, where he had been playing chess with Captain Watanabe and dozing off. His mouth turned down at the corners as he asked, "Did you get that message direct from a plane?" Atmospheric conditions were unusually fine for wireless reception that night. The radio operators aboard the Nagato could even hear the first American distress signals. The reports from the Japanese pilots came flooding in. Surprise attack successful, enemy warships torpedoed, outstanding results, Hickam Field attacked, outstanding results. The American messages were confused and panicky. When Yamamoto heard one of them Japanese, "This is the real thing," he smiled slightly. The conference room aboard the Nagato was soon filled with jubilant staff officers, though Yamamoto stood alone, oddly downcast. Within a few hours, it was clear that the surprise attack had knocked out at least 4 battleships. But as more reports trickled in, it was also apparent that the American aircraft carriers were not at their moorings in Pearl Harbor, and that the oil tanks had gone unscathed. Ugaki was for going back and finishing the job, but more cautious minds prevailed. The American carriers were somewhere out there. What if they caught the Japanese fleet as it was launching planes? The Japanese fleet commander, Chuichi Nagumo, who had never been enthusiastic about the Pearl Harbor raid, wanted to sail for home. Yamamoto, perhaps already resigned to fate, did not countermand him. Ugaki spluttered in his diary that Nagumo's lack of daring amounted to sneak thievery and contentment with a humble lot in life. Swing. The Japanese people knew nothing of these internal doubts and squabbles. They were wild with joy over the Japanese onslaught throughout the Pacific. On December 8th, Japanese forces swept south, invading the Philippines and Indonesia, and sinking on December 10th a British battleship, HMS Prince of Wales. The radio played the battleship march over and over again, and a popular singer crooned, "More victory news on the radio. I can't sit still, the excitement, the joy. Aren't our men superb, divine heroes in action?" At the Imperial Palace, wrote the Emperor's naval aide in his diary, the Emperor wore his naval uniform and seemed to be in a splendid mood. Yamamoto was depressed. He repaired to his cabin and wrote gloomy letters in response to the thousands of letters of congratulation that came pouring in. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply for the smitten, he wrote in response to an overjoyed friend. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. In another letter, he deplored the mindless rejoicing at home. It makes me fear that the first blow on Tokyo will make them wilt on the spot. Even so, Ugaki was proud of the Japanese midget subcrews. He believed that at least 2 had penetrated Pearl Harbor and torpedoed American warships, and that all the crewmen had perished gloriously. He was wrong. No Japanese sub did any damage, and 1 crewman had washed ashore and been captured and hence disgraced. Still, the Japanese martyred the others as the 9 heroes. Ugaki thought back to their farewell party at Kura on November 17th. The young lieutenants had signed their photographs with short mottos. Ugaki wanted to present their photos to the Emperor one day. Now it has really turned out to be the Second World War, he wrote in his diary on December 12th. The whole world will revolve around our empire. Then his unease returned. Pearl Harbor had not been the decisive battle. Perhaps there was no such thing, no sudden triumph. He was beginning to think like Yamamoto. On December 13th, he wrote that the zeal of the Japanese people will cool in the course of time. What if the war lasts for as long as 5 or 10 years? He wondered. Would the nation's leaders be able to maintain the people's morale and overcome every difficulty? In public, Ugaki's face hardened with resolve. In private writings, he seemed less certain.